say for the camera that this is June the 5th, 1999, and we are in the Carnegie Museum, in case anybody wasn't sure of that. And we're very fortunate today. We have two people come to give our program. I have known one of them for many years. Bill Anderson used to teach in the Pekin School District and was one of the best civics and government teachers I ever saw in action. He had those kids do a complete political campaign every time there was one. They played all the parts of all the candidates. They had rallies, they had decorations, they sang and danced and marched and paraded and invited legislators, so we got to go and observe. It was just wonderful. He's done, and I'm sure those kids will never forget what they learned there. I hope they don't. I've seen him give a program on Native American artifacts in the past, not necessarily limited to weaponry, but he did bring his, his favorite weapon right here, which he will tell us about. Then he also brought us a distinguished friend to help us, Anton. I'm sure you've all heard of him and seen his name in the paper many times. He's an archaeologist. He's the president of the Southeast Iowa chapter of the Iowa Archaeological Society. I believe you still are, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Last time I knew.
You haven't been ousted yet. He does many things. He does archaeological digs. He does not do this for a living. He takes people on field trips and does wonderful things with them. But in the rest of the time, and I have to read this because I don't understand what it is you do. I should probably ask you. Maybe I will let you tell us later on what it is you do.
Sure.
Okay. Anyway, they're going to talk to us about Native American weaponry, particularly, and I'm sure they'll be glad to have questions answered if you have any, or if any of you brought anything to be identified. And so, we'll have Mr. Till and Mr. Anderson.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I'll start first here. First of all, we bring you greetings from the Southeast Iowa Archaeology Chapter and the Iowa Archaeological Society, which is located out of Iowa City. We've been a chapter for, I guess, 5 or 6 years now. I'm Secretary-Treasurer of that group, and Anton is our president, and it's not too many of the 8 chapters in the state of Iowa have a president who is also an archaeologist. Anton's a fine teacher. I used to come to Pekin schools and present programs to my children. I did a lot with archaeology. It's a very high interest level for not just students, but for adults as well. Now, thank you, Betty, for inviting us today. A lot of fond memories with Frosty and Betty, and the many years that Frosty came to Pekin schools. I just assumed that he came to every school in the whole area, and he said no, really, he didn't attend very many schools, and so we were always happy to have him and our legislators come. And I spent 32 years at Pekin and decided to take early retirement 4 years ago, and after a few weeks my wife thought I should have something more meaningful to do, so I became city clerk. So our offices are side by side, which is kind of nice on the west side of the square of Richland. Little joke, she knows I'm there if she hears a stool flush at City Hall because the walls are pretty thin, so it's her way of checking on me. We're going to be talking about Indian weaponry today, and I want to just do a little prelude to what Anton's going to talk to you about. I kind of feel like if you've gone to concerts and they have somebody as a warm-up act for the main entertainment, well, Anton is the main entertainment today, and he has many things to share with you. And I want to just talk to you a little bit about a weapon that I know something about, and that's the atl-atl. A-T-L is how that's spelled. It's pronounced atl-atl. I'd like to pass, Betty, if you would give everybody one of these, please. And if you hand out everyone one of those, this is something that might be beneficial as I talked about the atl-atl a little bit. We also have newsletters from our Southeast Iowa chapter, and you're welcome to take one of those today. And we also have brochures on the Iowa Archaeological Society and something on the protection of ancient burials in Iowa, a lot of Indian mounds in the area. And we have bookmarks as well, so you're welcome to take those with you. If you would have lived in Iowa 10, 12,000 years ago when the last of the glaciers were retreating and the Indian people were coming here to live, you would have found the horse, camel, mammoth, mastodon, that type of animal. One of the weapons that was used at that time was an addle, and the little diagram that you have, I might show that to you first. And by the way, Anton drew this for us one time, and I used it in the classroom. And the addle is like a missile launcher, or a device for launching a spear or a dart with much more effectiveness than just throwing it by hand. And you have your main shaft, as you can see in your diagram, and you have your foreshaft, and you have the point, and then you have the addle itself. Now, this is the shaft itself, obviously, and this is the projectile point which disengages from it. If you're hunting a mammoth or a mastodon, you would want certainly to get that point into the animal and get out of the way as quickly as you could. So the idea is to throw it with as much force as you can. And we won't pick anybody out to be the animal today, but nobody ever wants to volunteer for that. But the idea was that you would, and I had this made for me by Toby Morrow, who is an archaeologist, and I bought it from him as a Christmas present for myself one Christmas. And the idea is that you launch it this way by throwing it, and it just sort of unfolds like that, as your diagram will show. And the idea is that when it strikes the animal, hopefully this will disengage into the animal, and he's going to be unhappy by now, of course. And then your shaft lies back. You have a little pouch of these. You stick another one in, and you take on the animal again. Now, you didn't live to be very long at this time. Maybe 25, 30 years was a good long age to live. A lot of people were killed. A lot of men were killed in hunting. Women didn't hunt. Men hunted. But this is the addle itself, which was commonly used, and of course you don't find them now because the wood is disintegrated. This is the shaft. This is the projectile point. This was also made for me by Anton. Now, this little weight right here, located right here, was a weight to balance this when you threw it. And this is called a birdstone, I guess because it looks like a bird. And it's made of sandstone. If any of you knew Bill Page, that lived in this area at one time, he found this or purchased it someplace and took a picture of it and loaned it to me to take to the classroom. But it was a little weight, and you can see a little hole in there, a little weight that was used to balance the, counterbalance the addle when you were throwing it. They do find these stones in this area. And so this is an addle, and it was a weapon that was used to hunt. This animal, I'm going to show you the lower jawbone of an animal here. This is a lower jawbone of a cute little baby mastodon. Now this animal would have been about 6 months old. This was found in a sand bar in the Skunk River by Clarence Bond, father of Russell Bond, if you know the Bonds that live in Richland. And I used to borrow this quite often. Russell said, why don't you just hold on to it? Something happens to me, make sure the kids know what it is. Well, Russell died about a year or two ago. And I checked with the children. They said, yes, we knew that you had that bill and you're welcome to keep it and use it until we need it back. And he had a wonderful collection. But the thing that's kind of neat about this is if you feel that in there, Betty.
Nothing bites me.
Nothing bites this little point.
Yeah.
This was a baby cutting a tooth. That may not be true, Anton, but it's a great story. Okay, anyway, that's what I was told. Okay, and we always question whether this was a mastodon or a mammoth, and our veterinary friends, Vidito and Anson over at Brighton, say it is a mastodon. One was a browser and one was a grazer. So this was a baby, this is the kind of animal that they hunted with an addle 10, 12,000 years ago. So I wanted to share those things with you.
I guess for a slow learner, I don't understand how this extra piece of wood makes the thrust.
If you'll look in
the
your...
weights, you didn't put the weights on, did you?
No, I don't have but if you look in your little sketch that you have right there, look in the other one, the one that's stapled together. And it shows a picture of a man throwing one, wrote about the 4th page. Because it's a little hard to imagine how much force you can use.
Extra leverage.
It's a leverage that you have And the idea is when you throw it, you let go, and then this goes through the air, and this, of course, you hold on to this. Then this hits the animal, the little point hits the animal, and sticks in the animal. Sticks in the animal, and the dart flies back at you, and you put another point on it.
I understand all that part, but the function of this shorter
This-
stick is the part
I
that
have
don't-
seen, and Anton, you've made some of these too, I have seen a man throw one of these half the length of a football field and hit a bale of hay. I mean, they're that effective.
Does he whip it? Is that?
He just, I don't want to get too much side to it here, but the idea is to project it through the air, and you can throw it up to 80 times more force doing this than you can just coming up
Sure.
and jabbing like that. The people, Toby Morrow was real good.
Show them how it works without the shaft in it.
Without this in it,
Show them that part, how you thrust it. To show them the leverage you can get.
okay, the idea is that you have it like this and you just throw it like that and it just flings it through the
Gives it
air.
the extra-
Yeah, it actually, you hook it into this, and this was all hand carved, and the idea is when you throw it with a lot more force. They have taken actually a 2-inch thick piece of wood with a projector point and rammed the point almost through it.
I'm always
at a
just
target.
amazed at how intelligent the Indians were.
Yeah.
You know,
I hate to throw this too much because it costs $60, I hate to break it, but the idea was, and we've practiced with these before. I used to have the students make them in school, and we didn't have the right balance here. We were trying to make them too heavy. I didn't understand that you just needed something light like that until I purchased this one. But the idea is that when you project it, it just sort of unfolds.
Do you have
It's
any
just like a
idea
projector
what wood
would-
is?
I don't know what that is. What kind of wood that
A
is.
lightweight wood?
It's a very lightweight wood. You know what that would be? What kind of wood?
That looks like willow,
I
probably.
wondered if it was.
Maybe
It might
willow.
be. A lot of these
Yeah.
archaeologists, and Anton makes a number of his own tools and weapons and things too, makes these things and give them to gifts, give them to friends as gifts, which makes a real nice type of thing. But that is an addle, and that's the addle itself.
What would the shaft be made out of? Same thing.
He got this from Arkansas. It's not wouldn't be bamboo, but is it a bamboo type? Real lightweight.
Could be river reed, they
Yeah.
use one of that.
The idea is that you don't need much of a payload to carry that. If this is sharp, it's going to penetrate. If you can get in between the ribs, it's going to penetrate. And kick this back, hopefully. And I don't have any pictures with me. We've got some pictures of showing them taking on a large animal. And as huge as these elephant-like creatures were, I imagine a lot of people lost their life by trying to take an animal like that.
Would that shaft typically have had feathers on it too for accuracy?
There's a little picture show one in the diagram. I don't know whether they do or not. I know that diagram from Toby Martin's book does. The one he made for me did not have feathers like an arrow would. Any other questions on an addle? ATL, addle. And it's kind of an unusual weapon. They still use these in Australia, places like that, but, and they have actually, people have taken deer and animals with these. Some of the western states. Some of the people that make these and practice with them are pretty adept at it. And it's hard to go out and do much with it, but if your life depended upon you, need a food supply, then you make use of it. You become pretty good at using whatever you have to use. Okay, now that's basically what I wanted to show you. And I'd like to introduce Anton to you, who has been a good friend for many, many years. And I'm not sure what he does. He came to Richmond a while back and looked at the old Opera House for us. Regional Planning Commission, housing specialist,
I'm director now of housing.
director of
Yeah.
housing
Right.
for Toma Regional Planning Commission, which is located on Indian Hills campus. And so, but he's also an archaeologist, so it's a real pleasure to introduce him to you today. Anton.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to be here with Bill and all you folks. And we're going to have a little discussions on weaponry, but really to understand weapons. I think a lot of the tools that we find, walk in farm fields and find arrowheads and spear points, many people think that because they find so many of them, there was a great war there. I mean, that's the most common story you hear. Well, the Indians had a big battle up on the hill, And the truth is that, yes, there was conflict amongst groups during prehistoric times and more so during the early historic period, caused by pressure from the Europeans coming in, putting pressure on other tribal groups. And there were more wars at that time. But prehistorically, I think there were certainly conflict, but most of the things that we find that we assume to be weapons are actually tools. Probably 95% of all the things you find that are either lithic or bone or whatever that were used for or can be assumed to be a weapon were really used for everyday work. This includes axes and things like that, spear points, atlatl points, and so forth. When I say tool, a tool as a projectile, spear point, for example, this particular one, which is the earliest form of projectile you'll find in Iowa. This is a Clovis point. They're extremely rare. They're noted by that very unique shape. They're more lanceolate and with a concave base, and they have the unique feature of having a real thin flake removed from the basal part of it, or the bottom part, that extends through the center. This, you can see on this one here, has a really nice flute taking out. It is a characteristic of this particular point. Clovis people, again, were atlatl users. They were also big game hunters. They were people who were probably small groups that lived in Iowa, all across North America. They essentially are groups of people that came from Asia and migrated into North America during a period probably, in some estimations, 60, 70, 80,000 years ago perhaps, as early as that. The new sciences suggest that we have found tools, pebble-type tools and other bone artifacts that have been carbon dated to at least 40,000 years. So I think as research continues, we'll find out that Asians were coming into North America at many, many times during various glacial interstages. Because there was during the Wisconsin, which is known as actually the last glacial period is the Wisconsin period. And during that period, glacial ice, there would be a series of ice that would migrate down. There would be a cold period, and then there would be periods when there would be melt. And these might be several thousand years between these different stages, these climatic stages within the ice age, last ice age. And during that time, people would move in groups. There were certainly many of the large mammals that the Clovis people were hunting were migratory animals like horses and camels and mastodons and mammoths in particular. Your mammoths were more grazing animals and they were in herds. And also a lot of the extinct forms of bison that were in North America at the time. And these people travel thousands of miles probably, small groups following the herds. Much like the native people would follow the caribou today up in the Arctic Circle area. Muskox, which are really holdovers from the Ice Age, travel in small groups and they're quite migratory. And these people again had developed a material culture that was essentially lightweight. It was very portable, and it was designed strictly to follow groups that can allow them to follow, take everything they had, their belongings, and travel hundreds of miles. Native people in North America are known for their ability to travel great distances. And of course that really increased when horses were reintroduced in North America. The horse actually evolved in North America. populated Asia, and then was cut off after the Ice Age. The great ice sheets melted and so forth. And when these native people got horses again, they became quite mobile, more so than they were originally by foot or canoe or so forth. And there's stories of people in Canada traveling as far as in South America where they saw little people, monkeys and so forth. They thought they were little midget people that lived in trees, and they were monkeys, And these are Canadian Indians. That's how far they would travel. So Clovis people moved around, and as a result, you'll find these particular types of points all throughout North America. And you also find projectile points like this and other different forms in later periods showing up all over North America at the same time, same type of shapes and sizes, and of course we classify these by cultural period. Projectiles, again, were probably the number one type of weapon that was used, whether it was hunting game or whatever. Atlatls certainly could be used for warfare. I mean, if there were conflicts between two groups, they can certainly throw weapons at each other. But if you look at warfare in general, going from the historic period, that's when Euro-Americans were in contact with Native Americans and walk backwards in time, you can see a lot of things change. If you go, I'm doing this instead of early, go back, go to the latest, and the historic period where the historic groups were getting various trade goods, and of course they would get trade guns and that sort of thing, and axes and trade metal and so forth. This example, for example, this was made by a Cheyenne, probably in the late 1880s, thereabouts. It's not really a practical weapon. This is a tomahawk, but it's a smoking hawk. If you look at it and hold it, it's not really a weapon. It's something that was used more for decoration. Yes, you could probably use it as a weapon, but it's just not. It's not a functional piece.
Did they trade to get that metal?
Well, this metal they were getting from the traders and so forth. Very common.
They didn't make that metal piece.
Oh no, this was hammered out by a Cheyenne blacksmith. There were native people who were in trades too, and this is probably like the 1880s, in that period, reservation period.
Why is it in hollow?
This is actually a pipe. This can be smoked. This is a form. The pipe axe was, it's called a pipe axe, and it was first introduced from your French and your British traders in the 17th century. It became real popular with Native Americans because they could now carry this in their belt and also use it as smoking, especially when they're on the war party or traveling or so forth. It's kind of a dual purpose type thing. And it was well accepted by Native people all throughout North America, the concept of it. And you got to remember, natives were just like anyone else. If they got something from the trader that was actually manufactured in a form like this, which they were, the more skilled ones would then get their own metal and make their own. They might have a pipe axe that's made out of catlinite. Most of them you'll see in the plains are actually catlinite, which is a real soft stone, pipestone from Pipestone, Minnesota. And they would shape it into an axe and also have a pipe with it, and then the long stem. So the handle would function as a pipe stem also. Just a joint piece, and again, very popular amongst the native people. So in the historic period, they had guns, which certainly were a very effective weapon. As you go back through time, at the early historic period, they were getting all sorts of metal objects, For example, the women would get large brass kettles and copper kettles and so forth from the traders, from the Europeans. And as they were used and no longer could be used for kettles, and the men would just disassemble them, and all the metal that was there, they would cut them up. They would get snips from Trader, tin snips, and allows them to cut various forms out. They would use a lot of them for decorations and stuff, but many of the pieces, the small pieces of metal, were actually used for arrowheads. Small projectiles in the late period, late historic period into the historic period, is when natives actually had bows and arrows. The bow was probably introduced somehow by somebody, or may have been a universal invention, about 2,000 years ago, which is not very long. So you're talking about, 2,000 years would be AD, I think some people believe, archaeologists believe around 800 AD, down to, in that neighborhood where actually the bow is being used. And the reason for that, because the small projectile points start showing up on native sites in North America at that time. Before that, they're all very large, and they're really spear points, and they were used in conjunction with the atlatl. When the bow came in, the projectile points became very, very small. In early historic period, you'll find real small triangular forms of projectile points. They're used with arrows, and they're made out of brass. And some are real small. Local collectors often call these things bird points, and really they're not bird points. Yes, you can use them for killing birds. Here's typical triangular forms that were used about 1000 AD, somewhere like that. Some of them quite small. Again, they're called bird points, but actually they are the true arrowhead. They're extremely deadly as a weapon. And the reason for that is two things. Is one, it has its own projectile shaft that's all connected. With the bow, the hunter could now project this at great velocities. The small projectile allowed it to literally penetrate through an animal. The atlatl and spear points like that are designed to enter into the animal and stay in there. Go deep enough into the animal that the animal will start bleeding. These are bleeding points. These are not kill points. Most of the projectiles, again, are designed to go into the animal, and you would repeat that process, essentially make a lot of holes in the animal, and the animal would literally bleed to death. The bow, on the other hand, it can penetrate through the animal, literally clear through the animal, into vital areas like the heart and lungs. The small points allowed it to go through the rib cage, and as this arrow suggests, and this is a vertebrae from a bison. You always can tell bison because bison vertebrae on their backs are extremely high. This is kind of the lower, getting down to the rear part of the animal, actually. Full adult bison vertebrae are much larger, about like this, and some of the spikes are that high. And that's why bison has that big hump on his back like that. All these vertebrae spikes come up like that, and they go through that back. And this projectile is steel or iron that was carved, polished out, using a file. They made their own projectiles. And this was off an arrow, but again, that's a large arrow. These are also called war arrows, but they're good hunting arrows. They're all-purpose arrow points. And this penetrated the bone as that far. And so the back of the animal is at least this thick, so it penetrates through all that meat and into the bone. There are a number of burials, human burials have been found with small projectiles like this embedded into various bones, through leg bones and into vertebrae. And we've actually discovered those in burials.
So Anton, this is really, when we talk about arrowheads, we're not talking about anything much bigger than that. I mean, these are true. Anything?
Well, the small ones, yes, they're true arrowheads. Now, these are arrowhead too, but in the plains, you're getting longer shafts, and some tribes have fairly good size shafts. If you look at any museum collection of early bows, 19th century bows, they're really small bows. They're designed they're very portable, so you can carry them on a horse or whatever. They're used in brush. You can hunt in real dense areas with them. They're really an effective weapon. They're not like the longbow that was developed, in Europe.
I think a lot of people will say, I found an arrowhead, but they really found a projectile pointer, a knife, didn't you? I mean, that's
Right.
not an arrowhead.
Mhm.
Okay.
And again, some of these, like this, is no doubt an atlatl point, and it was a weapon. It was also a hunting tool. And essentially, what you want to look at most of the stuff is hunting tools. The thing about warfare, if you look at the material culture from the historic period going on back, the majority of the things you'll find are weapons that were used in real close hand fighting. If there were any engagements between groups, the chances are you didn't see a group of natives over here and a group of natives over here shooting bows and back and forth at each other and just standing there. What they did was sneak up on each other, and there was an attack, and it was close in hand fighting. The most common weapon was used, and we don't have an example of it here, would be very similar to that shaft, but short shafts. They're about 3 to 4 feet long with a point attached to it. And these were just used for stabbing and close work, hand-to-hand combat. If you look at burials that were exhumed in out east, where there was quite a few Indian wars, different native groups fighting amongst themselves, most of the people that were killed because of crushing blows to their skull. And these were caused by these nice little weapons. This is a typical plains war axe. These things are extremely deadly. These were used, they're real long, as you can see, so you can get a lot of leverage. They're designed to hit the skull and just compress the skull in one area, killing you instantly. They can also be used in body blows, breaking the ribs, hitting vital areas, and literally they try to hit you in the heart, in this area, or the lungs. And these weapons are, because of the long shaft and the amount of power you can get with one of these weapons, they can break the rib cage and puncture lungs with them. Cause a lot of damage with these weapons. This is a good example of a war club. Again, inside here is a nodule. Many of them are made of chert, and in Iowa we can find chert nodules. They're very round like that. You find them round in nature, and they're extremely hard. It's the same material as this projectile is made from. We find balls like this on Oneota sites, which are a late prehistoric group that lived in Iowa. We believe the Oneota became the Iowa Indians. Again, this is wrapped in rawhide, and the rawhide then brought up around the shaft and held, and you can whip this thing, and again, designed to break bones. If you're hit in the arm with one of these, it'd break your arm. Designed to break bones, crush your skull, and so forth. Most of the blows, the kneecaps, anything like that, shin bones, you try to subdue your enemy any way you want. A good blow to the head, of course, works well, but A lot of times what they try to do is, in most of, and that's studying burials from actual battles, that there was tremendous blows to the legs and the bones, and you get your enemy down, then you finally hit him over the head and take the final, the end of the guy. But again, these weapons are specialty weapons. Now, most of the tools that you're going to find, and again, it's like 95% of them are tools like this. This tool is not a weapon, okay? It certainly could be used as a weapon, but again, most of these tools are actually woodworking tools. These are all-purpose tools. They're used for crushing, chopping trees down. The Indians had a technique of, they would actually chop a tree down, but would take a tool like this one, and it allows you to chop around a tree. These were used in conjunction with burning. They'd use controlled fire, and by burning around the base of a tree, and you can use a tool like this to chop around as the wood burned, you can literally fall a tree down. This one is called a celt, and again, it's a woodworking tool. It's not a weapon. This was put in as in a socket in a large wooden handle. This was a tool just like a large chisel. It's used for hollowing out logs. This particular tool was associated with what we call the woodland group, or the woodland culture. It was used about 500 AD to about 1000 AD. These are groundstone. This is known as a 3/4 grooved axe because there's a groove on 3/4 of it. Other axes, like this one here, is known as a full grooved axe. It has a groove all the way around it. And then there are other forms, like this one, and that's called a half groove. You just have a groove here and a groove here. And all these are different, made by different cultures that lived in Iowa. This was probably woodland. This may be archaic, earlier group. That's right after Paleo-Indian. And again, most of them were used for everyday chores, and there was just a lot of everyday chores to do. For example, bark was one of the primary sources of rope material. Cordage. Cordage is a very essential thing. I mean, we're sitting here and we're clothed with cords, essentially. Very, very small ones, but they're made from fiber. Either animal fiber or whatever, or synthetic fibers and things like that. Well, native people had clothes, and there were weaved clothes. But imagine living in this world with not having fiber, something long, stringy, ropey, that you can tie things with and so forth. The axes were used essentially to beat bark. The American linden tree is very common as a tree that was harvested, the bark, and they would beat the bark and separate fibers. Basswood basswood bark was used for rope making and things of that nature. And these axes were used on every day, spending a lot of hours beating bark and extracting these fibers off the bark, make rope. They're also used in crushing bone. A lot of the large mammal bones, for example, from a bison, there's a lot of marrow within the bones, especially the heavy leg bones, and you need some sort of heavy axe to crush those bones so you can extract the marrow. This one here, again, is very similar to this one, and again, it's a war club. Highly polished. You'll find them all different types of material. This is a lighter stone. It's a lighter stone than this one here. But again, used for the same purpose. Many of these weren't actually used as weapons. They were ceremonial pieces. You could use them as a weapon, but many of them were very decorative handles and had a lot of beadwork and quill work and things like that associated with them. And they were used in ceremonies and things of that nature. Well, from the historic period, you get, of course, metal and things like that, and the natives were using the metal from kettles and so forth, cutting them up, making them projectile points. Now, as you went back through time, the last group, right before the natives, the Europeans came to North America with the late prehistoric cultures, we call it the late historic period. And these were at a time where a lot of natives were living in fairly large groups. There were more horticultural groups. They were intensive gardening. There was fairly large populations. And because of their large groups and their dependence on agriculture in a way, they dominated very large areas in North America. And because of that domination, because of their size, they often had a lot of pressure from other groups, or they started to be quite aggressive with other neighboring groups. And you do find in the historic record, or the prehistoric record I should say, at that time, of considerable conflict between these groups, actually large wars, great massacres of people, thousands of people being slaughtered from one group to another. And again, it's probably because of similar reasons why people today have wars. Many of them are economic. They feel that they need more land, they need more resources, that sort of thing. Or they're expanding, or they're being pushed by another group and they have to find a way out, so they start pushing another group. And during the historic period, when Europeans came in, was really the start of the Great Wars in North America, essentially beginning with the French and Indian War. I mean, the French were essentially fighting the Iroquois and the League of the Iroquois for over close to over 150 years of constant battle with this group. And they had, during prehistoric time, the Iroquois groups, the League in particular, before whites got here, were a very aggressive group. It was the largest and most strong political group in North America, and they influenced people back in the 1500s and probably 1400s, cleared Ohio and Illinois and so forth. Some of the old legends they had of actually where they would travel from the New York area all the way out to Ohio and so forth on trading and war parties and things like that. Very aggressive group, very influenced a lot of people. In the late prehistoric groups, we had Algonquin groups associated with Algonquin people in the lakes area, and then we had what we call the Mississippian groups. And the Mississippian groups associated with, like, the Oneota, for example, a prehistoric group in Iowa, were known as Mississippian culture. And these people had a lot of influence from Mexico and that sort of thing. They were quite warlike. And there's some evidence in our archaeological literature and our research that the Algonquin groups and Mississippian groups were in conflict quite often. Here recently, a number of years ago, they were excavating a site down Weaver, and they found parts of people in some of the cache pits. These particular group, the Oneota, would dig large holes in the earth under the lodges, large enough so a person could get actually inside. And they would store food and things like that. But on several occasions, they would find parts of people in those cache pits. Whether they were Oneota or whether they were some visiting group, it's difficult to say, but there's some evidence that they not only killed them, but they probably ate part of them. So as you go through time, going backward in time, the most warlike time, and probably the time where weapons were being used the most, was during the late prehistoric time, late prehistoric period. When you get back earlier, we get into what we call the woodland. The woodland culture in Iowa, essentially is around 500 BC to 1000 AD. The woodland people were known for their burial mounds that we do find in around this area. The woodland extended clear into the eastern woodlands all the way out to western Iowa, all the way down to Florida, up into Canada. A large cultural group. They built burial mounds. They were the ones who used pottery at first, and were the first gardeners. There were definitely conflicts, and weapons were being used. Again, there's some evidence of that. They were using atlatls, but again, most of the weapons they were using were probably similar to these: crushing, hammering tools, short spears that were used, and things like that. But mostly, the evidence suggests that it was fairly peaceful amongst the groups. Again, these people were living all over Iowa. There's a lot of sites right here in Jefferson County. Most of these tools are probably associated with woodland culture. There were a lot of these people living around. And most part, I think they were fairly peaceful amongst themselves. When you get further back, we're getting to a period called the Archaic. And the Archaic is essentially a very large period going all the way almost to the Paleo-Indian period. And it really represents where people were living in an area that the climate had really changed from the glacial period. The glacial ice had moved out. Climate changed more to a temperate climate. And people were forced to become very innovative in their survival techniques. And as a result, you find a great invention, a period of invention of different tools, all different ways to use the environment. And it became extremely efficient in using the environment. And as far as weapon goes, it pretty much, during the Archaics, had the same type of weapons. There were projectile weapons, they had crushing weapons. Pretty consistent through time. One thing I wanted to say a little bit about the atlatl. The atlatl is, again, one of the universal weapon. It was used all over the world. You find it in Mexico, you find it in the Arctic Circle, you find it in Asia. You find it in Greeks were using atlatls. It's a real practical weapon. And again, what it does is it gives you that leverage, extend your arm into effective lever to throw a spear at a distance. Armies, for example, the Aztec army was, their primary weapon was the atlatl, and what they would have was large spears. Instead of having a socket at points, they would have maybe 10, 15 made-up spears they would carry with them, and then throw these things. The Iroquois, for example, had a similar type of weapon. They used the first Iroquois warriors they saw actually had armor. They wore armor. An Iroquois warrior would have a helmet, and it was usually made of wood slats. Their arms had a combination of wood and held together by a leather. They would use turtle shells for breastplates. If you ever, and there's some real old prints that were actually lithograph type things that were from drawings from some of the early missionaries in showing some of the early Iroquois warriors. And they were quite impressive. They had slat armor that went down their legs. It's pretty amazing. And it's something that we forget, that the groups that were had developed in the late prehistoric period were real sedentary, and they had fortified villages. These are called towns. Large forts, literally, had earthworks, all kinds of earthwork type arrangements, and they were just literally forts, like castles almost, in North America. And again, they were built as part of their defense of their cities and so forth. And many of these people, well organized, and could have a large standing army, essentially, in some of the Indian towns, where they can boast 500 or 600, 800 warriors. Some of the other groups, like the Iroquois, could boast 10,000 warriors that they could put into large canoes, travel. You get and fight with one of them, and a couple thousand of them show up on your doorstep, you know. And so weapons, again, they're all different forms. Majority of them, though, were used in real close conflict, hand-to-hand type situations. The majority of the tools that you find, though, whether they're stone or bone, are tools that were used in everyday work, for manufacturing things or whatever like that. Here's another type of point. This is a triangular type of point. And in Mexico, the Aztec, for example, made very large blades like this. Most of them made of obsidian. And what you do is find a number of these large ones. Some of them extremely large, they're about like that long. And some of the early people, like settlers that went down there, the Spanish, they thought they were just, you know, kind of spear points, but they're not. They're actually axes. And the Aztec would take a series of these and put them in, had a large handle, axe-like handle, and then he would socket at these, drive the point part into the handle. And they would create a large axe that's just had a series of these blades set vertically along it. And it's quite a weapon. And this would be the cutting edge. So some of these weapons were actually used that way. Now another thing too, you remember that some of these projectiles, like this one for example, could be used with an atlatl as a spear point, but many of them had short little handles and were used as knives. Knife is a very, very important tool to have, again, for cutting sinew and harvesting and skinning animals and all different types of functions you need a knife for. This actually is a point that is classified as a spear point, but in some literature it's called a knife, and called a Dickinson knife from Dickinson, Illinois. And these were hafted, we believe, in probably bone, large bone handles, and they were used as like pocket knives, hunting knives. So many of these tools that we find are not really spear points at all, but actually used as knives for, again, everyday type of work functions.
I read where a surgeon used one of those as an experiment instead of just as effective as a scalpel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the obsidian is actually, it's volcanic glass is what it is. And it's known as the sharpest substance in nature. And real small blades of this are used in scalpels for real delicate surgery on blood vessels and things like that. It's extremely sharp, and in fact, it's sharper than any known material, man-made material. And the advantage of this, you can derive a very microscopic blade off it, and it's ready to be used. And if you actually haft these micro scalpels, and they're hafted with real small, I mean, you can barely see the flake that's put inside those. And they're used for like taking an artery. It's so sharp you can pull an artery out, and you go right along and you can cut that artery right down the edge and open it up, and you can put splints in it and things like that, using with this particular material.
The Aztecs, and perhaps the Mayas, but the Aztecs used those for, on the sacrificial altar, they would, their victims would use that to cut the chest open and pull the heart out and use as an offering. And it is very sharp.
Yeah, it's
And
amazing.
we find it in Iowa because of the extensive trade, where it's been traded in from Colorado or someplace. It's not native to Iowa.
Yeah, this is Mexican
Yeah,
obsidian.
it's been traded
Uh,
in
Mex-
the
yeah.
trade network.
Mexican obsidians are
It's very
extremely.
sharp.
And I don't know. Now, here's a particular tool. And again, these things are actually drills, and again, used for drilling wood and bone, things like that nature.
What is it made of?
I think this is no, this is a real one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's made out of chert or flint. Chert is a sedimentary rock. You find it locally here. And it's got real fine crystal nature to it. And it's flaky, it's glass-like in a lot of ways. Obsidian is called the ultimate glass. But when you hit it a certain way, it fractures like glass. It has a fracture like glass. So it allows you to take it and hit it, control hitting it various ways and methods. You can shape it into different types of forms for different functions.
This happens to be Burlington chert or flint, which is a very high quality, works quite well. And this was found over by Lawrence Leisure, you know, the Leisures of Richland, and interesting story. And I have a lot of collection at City Hall where I work. And a lady brought that in one day, and she said, you know, I'm getting up in years. A lady in our church, and she said, you know, I know you love these things so much, I'd like to give this to you. And I said, wow, what a nice gift. And one in perfect condition like that's worth $375. So, of course, I would never sell. It's got a little damage there and there, but isn't it wonderful that someone would share something like that when it was of no value to her really at this time?
Now another thing, a different weapon, a classification of a weapon, some of these round balls are actually used as bolas. You can get several of these, be 3 of them together, and you tie them together with cordage, and you can swing one around and it goes, you know. Another thing for weapons were throwing sticks. You know, the boomerang is not just was used by people in Australia. The boomerang is a universal weapon, a very, very effective weapon. Throwing sticks were used in North America by all the different groups. You learned at a young age that you could take a stick and throw it at something for killing small mammals and birds in particular. Slingshots or slings were used. Again, a very effective weapon, but also a hunting tool, a hunting weapon. So anything you could throw. A common weapon, its same function as that, as an atlatl in a way, is a stick, and you have a long stick about long and a piece of rawhide that's hung on attached to the top of the stick and extends down about 3/4 away. And you have a little attachment there, and you can throw objects with that. Swing it as it goes, you can flip out, and you can throw. As a kid, I used to have those little sticks, and I just take a little piece of string, you attach it there, and you run it about 3/4 down, and you take a safety pin, you snap it off, and you just have the hook, the pin type with the eye, and you tie it on that string. And you take a nice little green apple, and you stick it in there, and you whip that, and you can whip that thing half a mile. I mean, you can whip it so far, and it really can irritate neighbors that they have no idea where all these apples are coming from. It works real good on the little apples out here, the crab apples, you know. But you can anything you can pierce and hang on there for a little bit, and you get a knack, and you just.
Did you learn
pretty
that
amazing.
before you went to Parsons College?
Oh yeah, I did that as a kid. I was just, yeah. But it's a pretty amazing. Now I have an atlatl home, and I throw it. I'm not very accurate with it, but I can whip it out pretty good. Most all atlatl spears, in my estimation, were after hafted. the tribal groups in South America, for example, they hunt with a similar device, but they're all shafts made up, and they'll carry a bag with half a dozen of them. They're real thin shafts and long. In Borneo, they use shafts, spears, hand-thrown spears. They're I would say about 3 meters long, about 14 feet long. They're real, and they're whippy. And when you get whipping, they throw them, and they kind of go. And there's a movie. It's called Birds, I believe, Dead Birds, and it's documents actually two Borneo groups, two tribal groups that were in conflict at the time. I don't know if you've ever seen this movie. It's an extraordinary movie because what it shows is actually a war sequence, a real one. And you'd have a group of maybe 300 warriors over here and 300 or so over here, and they're all equipped with these large spears. And what they would do in actually fighting, and I think what happened, it started at one of the wives or one of the women or kids or something. They have a series of gardens that this tribe, and when you got out of the lower highlands, they travel to the lowlands, and they might have to walk 10 to 15 miles to their gardens. And that's the most dangerous time to do that because that's where you can get kind of attacked by another group. And that's what happened. One of the women got killed and whatever. And these natives would kind of come together and threaten each other. A whole group, all 300 would beat their feet and yell and scream and then charge. And they'd run maybe 50 feet and then stop. See? And then they would back off. And then the other group would do that. And this would go on for hours, you know. Then eventually somebody in the group got enough fortitude to throw a spear. Okay? And they threw one of their spears. And then pretty soon they all threw their spears. And then just a cloud, the sky was full of these big long spears flying all over which way. And what's interesting about the movie is it shows the people getting hit by the spears. And most of them, when the spears came, they turned and ran. The other group would run. You'd run like crazy when the spears are coming at you. So all the wounds were in the back or in the buttocks. And it shows this really interesting sequence of this medicine, when there are shamans, local medicine men, trying to extract this long spear out of this fellow's buttocks. You know, he's like that. And but that's a lot of the warfare that was going on. It just demonstrates how a lot of it was, it was just a more, well, I don't know, more show than anything else. You know.
I think
The tail. The tail.
I don't think could be horse mane, but I don't think so. What do you think that is?
Probably elk.
Could be. And it's a single piece, see right up here. It's cut out flat like this, then it comes out, clear out like this. Then that shaft is attached, and then it's sewed right up.
Does that tail serve any purpose? It's just decorative?
It's kind of a decorative thing. And you got some beads on there. They hold it like that. They got a little rawhide so you don't lose it. The Pueblo had small wood clubs. You hold it about like that. And they were, they call them potato mashers. And they're really weird looking things. And again, when you look at one, you wouldn't expect to believe it's actually a war type type weapon, because they're only about that long, and they come up shaped like so, round, they're flat on top, and the club type tapers down, and in the bottom, the handle is a spike, a real sharp spike. And then have a piece of hide on it like that, so you grab your hand and you hold it like so. So you have this club here and a spike here. And again, what it was designed to you run at somebody and you hit them over the head, you know, or you turn quick and jab them in the belly with the spike, and then you go like that and hit them in the head with the club. You know, but most of the weapons you see are real. They're kind of unique things. And again, used for real close combat, you know.
What was Iowa's population of Indians before the white man had any influence? Before they
Well-
started to move them from the east?
Well, Iowa, I don't, there's been estimates back, late 19th century people, they were kind of interested in that. And at that time, when whites just got here, there were several tribal groups that probably numbered in 1,500 people. And I would say maybe in Iowa there may have been 5,000 people, 4,000 or 5,000 people. It's hard to say. But those tribes moved around like. Iowa, for example, would be down in this area, and then they would be around Sioux, up in the Sioux River. They'd go up in the, South Dakota, travel around a lot, you know, and so they were quite migratory.
I think the first record indicated 10 to 12,000 years ago was first evidence of Native Americans in Iowa country, which the glaciers were retreating and these animals were, and hunting was good at that time. And particularly then if you go down around Burlington and down the river bottom, that would be great hunting.
Well, they talk about them being such good conservationists, but there were so few people really compared
They
to
weren't.
what we have
The-
now.
See, a lot of the rumors, it's like weapons, you know, that's, again, most people find projectile points, tools, scraper, I think they're weapons, not a battle. Well, it's not, you know, yeah, they had battles and they had so forth. But again, they weren't like warfare today. It's essentially you're trying to literally annihilate the whole population. I mean, you had neighbors over here that spoke a different language, lived a different way, and you were Native American, you didn't like them, but you didn't kill them off. I mean, you did not literally annihilate them. Annihilation came in when the Europeans came in. Their whole concept of annihilation, they brought with them. The most thing that annihilated Native Americans was disease. And when Coronado, when he came into North America, when they went in from Florida and traveled across the southern part of the United States going westward, that killed more Native Americans than the history of all the warfare that they had between Europeans and Native Americans. They were estimated at least 5 to 10 million Native Americans died right after the Spanish entered North America.
Well, I was thinking about the resources.
Mhm.
So really comparatively few would have very little effect on the resources, even if they were rather
Right.
exorbitant in their usage.
Right. In the prehistoric times, I think they were probably, again, smaller populations. They had what we call a seasonal round, and natives, and that's the way you survived, was in the summer months, families that were all people that were related, the group could come together in a central location somewhere. Because there was enough resources to do so. You didn't have snow, you didn't have all that, and people could congregate into kind of a village setting. Now as fall approached, what people would do is split up again in small family groups, travel maybe hundreds of miles away from where they congregated during the summer months. And there they would set up their winter camps. Again, small groups. They would probably begin hoarding food all the way from the summer, transport it to these areas so they could survive the winter. If they the game, for example, was depleted in a particular area, they did have the opportunity to pick up and move somewhere else because there's no one was over there. Prehistorically, that's probably was the pattern. It worked great till the Europeans came in. Because when the Europeans came in, they settled, unlike the natives moved around a lot. When things got tough or something, they just picked up and left. The Europeans didn't. They built towns and cities. And once they were there, you couldn't get rid of them. I mean, they were scourged. What are you going to do with them? And they kept moving and moving and moving, further pushing into native territories. And again, the natives were being boxed in, and they had no alternatives. Where could they go? They couldn't do that seasonal around. It upset the whole thousands and thousands of years of cultural behavior with these new people coming in. And resources, they were not, and by looking at some of the things, what they made things out of, for example, their houses were made out of bark. And if you had 400 or 500 people living in a village, you had 100 lodges, huge lodges, all made from bark. Now, what do you think the impact would be on the local trees that were large enough to produce bark? They killed it. And there's accounts here along the Des Moines River of early people moving up along Des Moines, and where you knew you were coming close to a village, a Sauk village, for example, or a Muscogee village, by 2 or 3 miles from the village were nothing but dead trees. Elm trees in particular. And the biggest the elm, that's one of the ones they hit. And they would strip the elm from the bottom all the way up to the top and peel that whole bark clear off. And they'd use it over the lodges. And then, of course, the tree would die. So they did have impact on the environment.
It'd be a lot easier to harvest firewood then as the years went by.
Yeah, they
dropped the limb.
sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. In Alaska, there's evidence where the natives were during, spring, I don't know if you've been up there, but after spring, the storms, the trees are just, thousands of trees are just dead everywhere. I mean, from snow weights and everything, and it grows, it's a mess. And the natives, the new theory is they would burn off, set fire to the forest, and literally burn thousands and thousands of acres off. And why they did that was the minute all that burned off, it cleared out all that dead wood and stuff, and all the vegetation would grow, and the game would come from miles. They would come to that area, and they'd be living right there at the edge of it, and the game would literally come to them. They wouldn't have to hunt for it.
Excuse me, I don't want to interrupt anything. I think we usually promise people it will be about an hour. And
Okay.
everybody's welcome to stay and ask questions and look at everything that they brought. And I want to thank you both very, very much for devoting part of your Sunday to us. Thank you.
Okay.
We have newsletters, our information.